Hello, everyone. Welcome to Living Your Best Life with Eddie Stone. Hello, Eddie.
Hi, Perry. So nice to be with you tonight. Hello to everybody that's watching what we're doing this evening.
So what's new today, Eddie?
Well, there's a lot that's new. I'm looking forward to diving into our subject. I had quite a few people from our last call that reached out with different comments. I think jet fuel and the fact that they use nanoparticles, heavy metals to enhance the performance of jet fuel. I think there's a lot of people that sort of realize that even without the research data or the information to support it, people just, realize there's things going on in the sky that are not good for us. And so it's interesting to hear people's, thoughts and their own personal experiences. And a lot of people that really have suffered and had real health issues. There were several people that told me about, living around airports growing up, which obviously would increase your exposure. And I imagine there were a couple of people that were in their 70s. And I would guess that if they grew up around an airport, when they're in the 60s and 1970s and early 1980s, before there was any type of regulation, just sort of no telling, what kind of exposures and if there's nobody paying attention to it and it's damaging your immune system and damaging your DNAs. One gentleman was really talking about, he's got neuropathy, which you may know what neuropathy is, but for those that don't, that's essentially where you've got tingling and you lose feeling in your extremities, your fingers, your toes. You oftentimes think of neuropathy associated with someone that's suffering from diabetes, and the sugar molecules can destroy some of the pathways and how the nerve endings work. And, ultimately that can have a very bad outcome because circulation problems, immune system dysfunction and disruption. And we also know that heavy metals, essentially neurotoxins is what that amounts to, can also have the same impact. So it was interesting. The one gentleman had a great attitude, but there was also, I felt some sadness and some empathy for the fact that he's struggled for so long. And, my own belief is that I understand that in a modern world, things happen, but I sure do wish we could get have it acknowledged to us so we could do something to at least better take care of ourselves. But it is what it is. And so that's a little bit of our subject this week. We're going to talk a little bit about geoengineering of the weather. And I think a lot of people have had suspicions about that. And with declassified documents now, we know that's really been going on at various levels. What used to be really probably, Perry, was mostly conspiracy theory with declassification of government documents, not just in the U.S., but other parts of the world. Now we know it's not just a conspiracy. There are things that are going on. Now, there may be beliefs that are too extreme for what really is happening, but there's no question it affects us. And so, yeah, it's interesting hearing what people's experiences are, not just in the States. I have had fun playing with the Google Translator for a person in Germany that's been communicating with me. I don't know German, but I love the Google Translator. I think we're mostly getting each other's conversation. So that's what's been going on, and we're hopefully here in North Carolina, where I live, I hope we only have 2 or 3 more weeks of winter so we get into some warm weather. You make me jealous each week when you talk about the warm weather in Thailand. Makes me want to come and visit. So anyway, I'm looking forward to hopefully an early spring here. We'll see.
Okay. Eddie, can I ask you a question about candida before we start that?
Yes.
Because now food this day, like bread, sugar, everything that increase the growth of candida in our bodies. But what can it cause us, Eddie? What kind of sickness that we can get from candida?
Well, candida, for those that don't know the terminology, candida is a yeast growth or bloom. I mean, you hear all kinds of ways to describe it, but it's basically yeast. And in this case, it's not good yeast. There are plenty of good yeast, and yeast is utilized to fortify and or flavor beer, wine. It's used in cooking. You've got baker's yeast, and baker's yeast is purchased live and it's used in leavened bread, right? So it gives rise to bread and gives it flavor, and different types of yeast, or strains of yeast is probably the proper way to say it, can give the bread a different type of flavor. When you cook it, it dies off. Some people worry that the yeast in the bread that was cooked or baked will contribute to their problems with candida, and that's not true, because that yeast is killed off. It still has a nutty little flavor. It contributes to the bread. Its contribution is in the cooking process and the rising, and it does have some leftover nutritional value. Brewer's yeast is similar, except in this case, it's strains that are utilized for fermenting alcohol principally, but it has a variety of other things. It can be purchased live, but is killed off in the process. Not as much nutrition, as you would find in baker's yeast. After it's done, it's a little bit bitter, but that can be used in the flavoring of alcohol. And then the most popular yeast from a nutrition or health standpoint is called nutritional yeast, right? And I'll bet our audience, which is a well-educated audience on nutrition, probably knows quite a bit about nutritional yeast. It's also killed off, so it's not a live organism that can contribute to the growth of candida, but it has a lot of wonderful vitamins. Not to get too far away from your question, but for those that, particularly if you're a vegan or a pretty hardcore vegetarian, let's say, nutritional yeast can be very, very friendly and helpful at trying to live a healthy lifestyle, because there's some things you'll get from that normally you would associate with animal products, particularly dairy. And so nutritional yeast can be a terrific source of your B vitamins, particularly B12. So it can help out with B12 deficiency, which vegans that don't pay attention, that's potentially a health hazard. It's also a powerful antioxidant, so helps out with those free radicals that are contributing to the damaging of your DNA, and also can play a role in contributing to getting older faster, right? Elasticity of skin, things like that. And of course, nutritional yeast can be terrific for your immune system. And then there's trace minerals. So there's benefits there, but where the confusion comes into play is people feel like, well, maybe that is contributing to, I've got a yeast bloom or a yeast problem. And for those that have yeast problems, it's really difficult to bring it under control. And it will require, for a lot of them, a really special diet, which basically is a lot of dietary restriction, because once you get a yeast bloom going, it essentially lives off of sugary foods, starchy foods. And so when I say starchy foods, let's take bread, for example. When people would say, well, the yeast in bread might contribute to my candida, that's not quite right. It's the bread and how quickly the bread breaks down into glucose that feeds the existing candida. Mm-hmm. And so that's where that challenge comes from. So there are products people can buy. There are enzyme products, which can be good. There are herbal mixtures that can be good at helping people better control candida. Essentially, though, if you have a problem, and so there's several ways to notice it. One is a fairly chronic loose stool, an inconsistency, excess gas and bloating. And it's it's sort of the gas and bloating that doesn't want to go away. It just you always feel like there's a little rumble in the tummy, and things never really feel fully settled. You don't go to the bathroom and relieve yourself and feel satisfied. There can actually be anal leakage, and the problem there is, once that occurs, now you've got the potential for cross-contamination, particularly for women in the vagina, where now they can get actually a yeast infection that they've given to themselves because they have a yeast problem in their bowel. And so they've got to be careful. And I encourage people to seek medical attention and not let this go on and on and on. Get some professional help. It's more than just paying attention to your diet if you've got this sort of cross-contamination problem. And so it's more than likely the biggest digestive problem that most people have that have a diet that really features a lot of what I would call ultra-processed foods, because they're in a sort of a never-ending cycle where, one, they're not getting good bacteria that would help to populate the intestine and crowd out the yeast bloom, and instead they're eating all these processed foods that essentially will feed the yeast bloom. And so it's this cycle that people get trapped in. And so, and once this takes over in your digestive system, it's not uncommon that now you can have runaway indigestion, heartburn. Now a person's probably taking antacids, which are not a good idea, particularly on a long-term basis, because they diminish the value, or they diminish stomach acids when you're using them. So now you're not digesting food properly. And so essentially you have what I would refer to as bad bacteria take over and populate your intestine, which is principally going to be the yeast. And so once you get into this cycle, in order to arrest it or bring it under control, you're going to have to make some really serious dietary changes. But in the short term, there's going to have to be some dietary sacrifices. And so a strict diet is what will be in order. And some people's bodies are more likely to be a grooming or a growing site for yeast, right? Two people might eat exactly the same way, but because their biochemistry is different, one may suffer a problem more so than another. But the bottom line is there's no reason for someone that has any kind of dietary discipline that they can't beat this issue. They can get online and get some natural solutions. I would not only rely on that. I would talk to a medical professional if you've got a real issue, but I know there are some great plant-based enzyme products out there, herbal products. We don't sell anything in this category. Where our products can be useful is by supplying the body, let's say with our super green juice, or even with our Super Greens Plus D, which is probably where you would get the heaviest dosage of pre and probiotics, both spore form or non-spore former. That allows you, think of it this way, it's like planting in your garden things that are going to crowd out the weeds. And I know that's probably odd to sort of think of it that way for your body, but that's incredibly helpful in supporting your body's ability to beat yeast back, because we're all exposed to yeast. It's in the air, it's on the surface of my desk. I mean, it's just all around us. That's why when they are fermenting grapes back in the day, when grapes were fermented, sometimes in open barrels or vats, the flavor that came off the ceiling, which is essentially the bacteria that led to the types of yeast that would grow in certain regions. So certain regions of the world would have different flavors, basically based upon the type of yeast that was there. So it's an interesting subject. It's interesting. All yeast isn't bad, but if you've got candida problems, it's something to pay attention to and to deal with.
So the best thing is like we should consume more like green stuff, green vegetables, right?
Yeah, there's no question. In this case, if you've got a candida problem, it's more about trying to eliminate ultra-processed foods, particularly starchy foods and foods with a lot of sugar. I mean, this is really going to make the problem worse, right? It's going to exacerbate the problem. If you can then be smart, right, and think about eating fermented foods have pro and prebiotics, particularly fermented foods, because the fermented title tells you that they're pre-digested. That's one way to think about that. And they are terrific feeder food for the good microorganisms in your bowel and intestine that needs to be fortified to beat back the yeast, right? It's almost like thinking of a battle between the bad bacteria and the good bacteria, and the fermented foods you eat will be consumed by the good bacteria, not the bad bacteria. The bad bacteria doesn't want those things. Mm-hmm. And so that's why fermented fibrous foods, the Japanese eat a lot of miso. Miso is a terrific source of a healthy fermented food. Of course, the Koreans are famous for their kimchi, their fermented cabbage, which is just fantastic. And even the bacteria there will be different from one region to another, or the way that they're spiced and flavored. And I personally, I think we've talked on the show before about the human biome. And the human biome is this, it feels odd for people to think about it, right? Because essentially, if you think about your body and your body weight, and I think we've spoken about this, that we know that when we test human DNA, only about 15% of the DNA in DNA testing of humans is actually human DNA. The rest are complementary microorganisms. those microorganisms essentially live off of the fermented foods and the foods you eat. And so that's why the plant-based diets and things like that are so helpful, because they essentially feed these beneficial microorganisms that live in a symbiotic relationship with us. The human biome is generally what's referred to in your gut. And this is, you can almost measure the health of a person and make some predictions about future diseases based upon the sturdiness and the microorganism count associated with the human biome. In the States, this may be true in Thailand, I'm uncertain, you can actually send off a stool sample to a national database and get yourself registered and find out what your numbers are. There's a lot of belief that the medical community, as well as the nutritional community, over the coming years will be able to utilize what we're learning about the biome to really tailor diets and other things that people can do to really strengthen their health and their immune system, particularly. So anyway, I didn't mean to get us off track with that. But greens, and if you don't have access to greens, then find a greens product like we use. If you really got a problem, you need to repopulate your intestine because of some of these issues. Our Super Greens Plus D is a terrific product. There are other probiotics out there. Don't just buy it, though, based upon the bacteria count or the CFUs. Make sure you learn a little bit more, look at the reputation, study the company, because all of them aren't created equally. And you always want to look for plant-based. So hopefully that will help. And we can, if we have further questions down the road on this, happy to jump back into the subject.
Eddie, you were talking about the miso soup. Miso is made from soy, right? But
that's correct.
But also we know that like soy now is like more GMO too. So how do we know which one we can consume? But they said like all of soy. I mean, mostly. So how can?
Well, it is a complicated subject. And as a consumer, there's kind of a buyer beware situation that I encourage people to think about. So you can buy soy. Most of the time it's going to come from local groceries, local vendors, but you can buy soy that's non-GMO. And when they say most soy is genetically modified, what they're really referring to is the soy that's grown to be utilized in food processing. That's mostly where that's coming from. And it's really, when you look at the details, it's really surprising how much soy is a part of all processed foods, even in places where you just like, well, why is that there, right? It's just one of those very common ingredients, almost like corn, very ubiquitous because of its malleability in processing food, and they can flavor it and they can add texture to vegan burgers. I mean, there's a variety of ways they use it. But when you're buying a good miso, it should say that it's organic. It should identify itself as being non-GMO. There are organizations that you can, see their verification badges on those products. And in those cases, that's really a very healthy, beneficial product, or food, I should say. Shouldn't even really call it a product. It's just a food. It's teeming with enzymes and all types of trace minerals and other things that are just really, really terrific for you. So I agree with you. A lot of soy you wouldn't want to touch. And I think most people should not eat very much soy at all unless they do understand where it comes from. And even then, it's just like anything else. Moderation is a great practice. So I hear what you're saying about that.
Okay, so now we are going to talk about your topic. Okay, very interesting.
Yeah. So I wanted to bring this up because I felt like it was connected to the subject matter we've had lately, whether we're talking about the wildfires or other pollutants or the jet fuel. And one of the subjects that I know, because I see some of the comments, from your listeners, is people are concerned about the geoengineering of our weather. And as I said before, it wasn't too long ago where people just thought that was all conspiracy theory, not to worry about it. But declassified documents really point to the fact that, at least in the United States, efforts to geoengineer the weather, or maybe call it experiments if you want to, go back as far as 1978. So it's been something that's been around, and who's to say it didn't even happen before then, right? I mean, I'm not really sure. And some of it you can think maybe has a bit of a noble goal. We've got climate change going on in the world at a rate that we've never seen. And climate change, regardless of what we think the sourcing is a real issue. Now, you might argue that it's man-made, that it's made by government, or that it's made by animals. You could argue, or it's just time. But the bottom line is there is climate change taking place. And so you've got record-breaking issues around the globe, whether we're talking about temperatures, you've got species going extinct on mountainsides and other things because the rainfall levels change. I mean, there's just a lot of things that are happening. You got volatile weather patterns all across the world. And sometimes people will say, well, we're having a cold winter. Clearly, the world is not warming up. But you can't confuse the weather, the temperature, with climate change. You know, the polar ice caps and things like that melting are very real issues. And so, you know, there's some people, and I'm sure, you know, there are some people in sort of positions of authority that maybe they are looking to see if there's military type solutions to deal with climate change instead of, unfortunately, you know, trying to deal with it on a grassroots level and think a little bit about what we're doing from a environmental pollution standpoint or other habits that we have. And I don't want anybody to think I'm trying to portray myself as an expert in this area and or a person with a solution, but I'm aware of it. And, you know, what I believe is that efforts to modify the weather are very dangerous, and the consequences can be really severe because some of the larger scale experiments and things involve trying to modify the weather by shooting lasers into the sky combined with nanoparticles, and essentially trying to create a heat reflective type of environment at a cloud-based level. And there have been several, a large article a few years ago in the Atlantic, which is a feature magazine here in the States, talked about the efforts. And, you know, essentially they're, for this to work out, you know, they would fly very large aircraft, think of things like 747s, you know, around the world. And essentially they're putting particles, which are essentially heavy metals, reflective particles, into the sky. And they're trying to create somewhat of a barrier so that the rays of the sun don't continue to heat up the earth at the same pace that it is. But of course, as weather occurs and rain happens and those things wash into, you know, the earth's atmosphere and onto our soil, they create acidity. And you quite literally could find yourself in a situation where what you put up in the sky as it washes to the ground creates soil that's so acidic you can no longer grow crops there. And so sometimes as people are trying to create one solution, they create another problem. And so I don't have these answers. I just know for me, as I think about this kind of stuff, it concerns me. And it just, maybe the biggest side of this that concerns me is not only is the traditional heavy metals that we think about, but it's a lot of aluminum. And so aluminum particles, because one, they're light, and two, because of their reflective qualities, are often, you know, used in this situation. And aluminum is interesting. Most people's bodies are able to manage some exposure to aluminum that comes from a dietary standpoint, either from water or in food prep. You know, a lot of ultra-processed foods are going to have aluminum in there. Could be from wrappers, could be from just preparation pans, whatever it happens to be. The body, your intestines do a pretty good job of insulating the rest of your body. Most people don't tend to think about this, but your intestines are essentially a closed system that has essentially safety measures designed to prevent certain things from escaping your intestines, either because of their size or their chemical composition. You know, you can think from an evolutionary standpoint, as man was coming into form, it was one way to protect ourselves from poisons or other things, right? So it might get into the intestines and can cause a lot of problems, but maybe it doesn't get into the bloodstream or up into the brain or into the heart or areas of this kind. And so we've got a fairly strong protective system. I mean, our bodies are built to survive, and they absorb, let's say, about a 0.03 percentage level, which is not a good idea, but a manageable situation. The problem is airborne nano-sized particles of aluminum going in through the lungs now, without going into your digestive system, without having to have been metabolized by your liver, which would have definitely given you some protection, it goes directly into your bloodstream. And so now the risks are far greater here. And, not everybody with the same exposure is going to have the same trouble. Our biochemistries are all different. And so we all face different issues. But for those that are vulnerable, you're talking about issues with seizures, kidney damage, bone deformities, endocrine system disruptions, hormonal disruptions, dysfunction. And so your risk of disease, developing disease, your risk of brain associated diseases accelerate. When we just bottom line know, when we study populations that are exposed to these kinds of chemicals because of the industrial environment with which they live, they have clusters where their percentages of getting these diseases are higher. That's hard science. And so for myself, not only do I believe people need to try to think about the environment they live in, and sometimes you can't change it. Sometimes just where you live is where you live. But that doesn't mean you can't have a secondary strategy to at least make sure in your home, through filtration of both air and water, you're trying to protect yourself. And your diet is one that supports the body's ability to get rid of these heavy metals, environmental pollution. So again, I'll just go back to our common theme. Fresh fruits and vegetables as much as you can afford, leaning towards as much green leafy, dark vegetables. That's really ideal, as heavy a fiber diet as you can. If you don't have access, find yourself a good set of dietary supplements. And I'm not talking about a multivitamin. I'm talking about greens drinks very specifically. Find yourself a good quality product. I believe we have a good quality product, but it doesn't matter to me whether you use ours or not. Go find one because you've got to support your body's ability to manage these things. So I just thought I would touch on that subject. It seems like it's something our listeners have been reaching out and asking questions about. And it is concerning. I don't know as citizens what we can do to affect it. It's more about what we can do to try to protect ourselves and our family with good habits and other things. And maybe we pay attention, and maybe at some point we find a way to affect the issue. But I'm not certain about that part.
But whatever we eat, I think at the end we all have to detox, because toxic is in the air, in water, in food too, even the organic. So whatever we eat, okay, we get nutrition from the food and fruits, and then we have to detox. That's the
it's got to be a strategy, right? You have to, just as you're thinking about the quality of the foods, you need to think about how it impacts the body's ability to detox and get rid of waste, because you're right. In a modern world, that's just what we live with, right? That's just the environment we live in.
Yeah. Okay, Eddie, thank you so much for being here with us. And then we'll see you again on Thursday.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Yeah.
Okay, so welcome anybody who wants to join us there.
Please. Thank you, Perry. Have a great day, I should say.
Okay, thank you very much, Eddie. Bye.
Bye.